Our opening shot is here of, as it says, Beech House by a well-known local artist or local failed artist, C.B. Core. Many of you know his claim to fame was to have submitted paintings for 40 years to the Royal Academy and never ever having one of his pictures hung. So let's start. Now, we're quite fortunate. Here's a map produced by Patrick Darby, a plan of the Manor of Dulwich in 1806. And we're going to use it to walk down the road, along with our guide here, which is Edward's Companion from London to Brighthelmstone, or Brighton as it is now, published in 1801, but surveyed about 10 years earlier. And so there'll be some houses missing here. And he describes, so he comes down Red Post Hill, which is here. At this point, Casina House isn't built. He comes down here, he comes down, and he comes, as he says, on the left, the White Hart. So he comes here and there's the White Hart Inn, which is there. If you look there, there's Lindenhurst. You'll know that shot today. You won't, not perhaps with a cyclist in that outfit. Clark's Green, Lindenhurst, and that's where the pub used to be. And there's the road up towards North Dulwich. And of course, the police box to keep the riffraff out of Dulwich Village. And then it talks about, this is Lindenhurst here, owned by Robert Woodmast. Then there's a white boarded house, and this is Thomas Turk's house, and that was demolished for the construction of East Dulwich Grove, because East Dulwich Grove comes much later. And then you have further houses, you have the Hall, and you have what is known as the White House. We would now know it as St. Austins, the Jags Prep, or nursery school, and that was the White House. And they say, yes, the road which comes from Brockwell Green through Island Green, which is in fact where Herne Hill is now, comes in at that road. We would know that as Village Way. But here's right, and you can see here's Casina House. You can see the lake, and then the road down into the village. You've seen that shot. Slightly closer looked. So this is here's the road joining Island Green. Here is the pub. Here is Lindenhurst. Here is the White House. Here is Pond House. The road is a different location. It was moved to this location after the railway line arrived. And then it talks about Pond Place, which is Menival, which is this house here, which we'll talk about. Here's the Hall, and this is Lake Cottage, named after, obviously, what was the lake? In fact, it's the Long Pond. I wasn't quite sure what it was built for, but anyway, it was there till about 1860, and that's where the shops are now. And it says here the Long Pond, but we're not going beyond there. We're just dealing with these houses here. And here's another map. Here's another guide we have, which is Edward Mogg's Patterson's Roads, which again comes down the hill, but this time we have Casino. It's slightly later. We have Dulwich House, Musprat, which wasn't on the previous map. We have Clark in Lindenhurst. And another Clark in the White House. We'll come on to lots of Clarks, and there's various other odds and sods, and you can see it here. Here's Casina, and here's Musprat here, and here's the other houses all here. So let's start with Casina House at the top of the hill, often known as Casino, but in fact originally Casina, built for Richard Shaw, a wealthy solicitor who'd made his money defending Warren Hastings, the former governor of India, governor of Bengal, who was charged in Parliament with corruption. And he got him off and made a lot of money out of it. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of him, but we do have a picture of some of the other owners. And one of them here is Thomas Spring Rice, MP, and Chancellor of the Exchequer between 1835 and 1839. And he lived at the house more or less as his country residence. And then we have William Henry Stone, MP for Portsmouth, who lived in it afterwards. But this is a list of all the various tenants who lived in there until finally all these houses go into the ownership of the Dulwich estate, and then they're shortly afterwards pulled down. This is the shot. This is a better coloured shot, slightly out of focus because it's blown up, but it shows you this is Warren Hastings, who, the governor of Bengal, who they made his money. The Shaw made his money defending. And this is his illustration. This is where we get to know he used John Nash as the architect. And you can see there's all these properties, and he sold it in 1826, or his executors sold it for 8,000, just over £8,000. That's a huge sum of money at the time. Here's his grave, his tomb in the Dulwich burial ground. And I just thought this was an interesting one. When he died in 1817, his property was put up for sale. And look at the amount. I mean, one questions whether he just died of drink. The quantity of alcohol that he must have had in his cellar, 2,000-3,000, probably 5,000 or 6,000, no, more than that, 3,000, nearly 3,000, 6,000, probably 7,000 or 8,000 bottles of wine and spirits. They knew how to look after themselves, and obviously they didn't worry about 14 units a week. And as I say, they're all lying in his cellars at his house, and you could go and buy it. Here we come across, this is Dulwich historian Tom Morris, who was, of short stature. He was a violinist and artist, quite popular as a violinist with Queen Victoria, apparently. But he wrote various historical histories of Dulwich around the turn of the 20th century. And a lot of his things, and we're going to pick up a lot of the things he said, which are sort of true, but not true. And this is one of them. This is the various rumours of royalty staying at Casina House. They were supposed to be Joseph Bonaparte, who was Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, later the King of Spain. He did visit Camberwell because he had been to America representing Napoleon with the US, the United States. And he married an American woman over there. Napoleon, a very young girl. Napoleon's very unhappy. And he got them back here to England, and he made them annul the marriage. But she certainly had the baby in Camberwell. So she could, it's possible, but there's nothing in the records of the house to suggest that he was there. And likewise, Louis Napoleon, when he fled from France after the Franco-Prussian War, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but there's no way. Tom Morris hints that he did, but we've found no record to say he did. But let's have a look here. This is the Dulwich estate map of 1852. Here's Lindenhurst. Here's the pub. Here's the hall. Here's Menival, Lake Cottage, the Long Pond, the White House, and Beech House. And this is where the shops are now. And here's the burial ground just over here. And the school would be roughly about here. But and there's Pond House here. But we're going to go down this road to start with. We're going to see Lindenhurst, built 1768. And when you look at the front, is this rather nice classical front. When you look at the back, or perhaps for above, it isn't quite the same. It's obviously been added to and mucked about with over the years. But the interesting thing about Lindenhurst is it has the original casement windows. All the other Georgian houses of the same period in Dulwich have sliding sashes, which were put in afterwards. Here's Pond House, built originally 1758. Although I have to say what you see there today is a 1960s reconstruction. I mean, there are some original bits and it's quite a big house, but it's, how can we say, it's been neo-Georgianized far more than it ever was originally when it had various large extensions in, a bit like Bell House today, not Victorian extensions. But we're going to go to Dulwich Place or Surrey Lodge. This is, so we're coming on, this is Half Moon Lane. And this is Richard Henry Clark in the White House. So we're coming along what is now, sorry, Half Moon Lane. And here is the house. This is what it looked like. It was, and there's a better picture, demolished. It was only demolished in the early 1960s. And is the site of the Judith Kerr School. Here's a list of the tenants and occupiers. It probably goes back quite a long way, but I've arbitrarily picked dates of the late 18th century when it was supposedly built by Alderman Brass Crosby.
One of the Schroders.
He of
he's buried in the.
He as bold as brass, and there was an article in the Dulwich Dulwich Society Journal recently about him, because the phrase bold as brass comes from his name, Alderman Brass Crosby. And there are various huge number of people, only a few of which we'll talk about, but to take the whole lot would take most of the evening. So here's Brass Crosby, and there's Octavius Wagram, who was here and there in the 1840s. And here again is our friend Tom Morris, because in his notes, he says that that one of the occupiers of this house was a lady of title who lived there and was a morganatic married to a royal personage. And what he's referring to is the wife of George IV, the first wife of George IV, where the wedding was annulled later. And Wagram, the interesting thing is Wagram was involved. He was on guard at Westminster Abbey as a trooper at the coronation of King George IV, when Queen Caroline, the Queen's estranged morganatic wife, tried to enter the abbey by force and claim her right to be with her supposed husband at the time. But she was turned away, they kept her away, and he was the one, or one of the troopers who did it. And so, as I said earlier, there's some truth in what Tom says, but it's never quite what he says, but there is something there. We're looking later, we've got George Bevington here, a leather factor. And then the interesting thing here is that the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway come along. And like today, if you're building a railway, you can compulsorily purchase the land. And they did, they compulsorily purchased the house and built their railway and moved what was built Village Way. And then they sold it back to this timber merchant here, Richard May, quite a successful timber merchant. And then, but he didn't live there. He lived in in Pond House. And he was quite keen to redevelop the site, but never quite got round to it. And in the end, he let it out to various schools. And you'll see here, these names here, Mrs. McFarlane, Miss Fanny Reed, they all ran schools. But anyway, went to William Mitchell, the builder in the village. And then when he'd had enough, it was taken over by the Church of England Temperance Society and called Ellison Lodge. Here's Henry Ellison, founder of the temperance movement, and it was named after him. And you can see here that it was founded in 1862, and it leads to the probation service today. I didn't know that, interestingly. But here's a note, drunkards. It was mainly for women who had alcohol problems, as we would call it today. It shows you in a way how desperate the estate were to get rid of these large houses, and we'll see it later. They have all sorts of approaches from us to strange uses, because they were too big. Even by then, people didn't want to live in them. And here we go. There's the retreat for drunkards at Ellison Lodge, Half Moon Lane. It was later used as a school. This is Glenshee School in the 1930s, so you've got pictures of it. And the ladies who ran this, obviously it closed in the war, Second World War, and they moved on to run the village bookshop in Carlton, Dulwich Bookshops. Yes, village bookshop in Carlton Avenue. And later, of course, we know it now as it became the James Black, it came King's College and it came to James Black Centre. Of course, Sir James, a well-known Dulwich resident, in fact, a near neighbour of mine. And the school, the King's College, knocked down the original house, built this, not everybody's favourite design, but of the time, and it's now Judith Kerr School. But let's move back along the road. Let's move back along Half Moon Lane, down Village Way, back to the junction of Dulwich Village, or High Street Dulwich as it was then. Here's East Dulwich Grove, here's Village Way. So we're sort of standing in Red Post Hill. There's the water trough that was in the middle of the road. And here's the police box again to keep the less attractive residents out. These are the houses still here today, built in 1902. But in the distance, you have Beech House, which we'll come on to later. So here we are at the White House, which is now on the right-hand side. We were standing here Here's Clark's Green. You'll know it today where you cross, where you got the white posts and the trees there. And here's the house. White House was owned at the time by Richard Henry Clark. Interestingly, his brother, Charles Clark, lived across the road here in Lindenhurst, and his father, another Richard Clark, lived further up the road here. But here's the land. So you've got Village Way. This is the White House on the corner. And here's the extent of the land that he owned. Now, his business was biscuits, ship's biscuits to be precise. And he was a partner of the sons of the well-known in the city anyway, Billy Biscuit, who pretty well had a monopoly on ship's biscuits for the Royal Navy. They had a huge business. And here, this is Richard Clark, father, lent him £5,000 to enter into partnership with the chap's sons. Here's some ship's biscuits. And of course, here's the HMS Victory, which the biscuits were used to propel, as it were, to keep the men happy. But it was a huge business, fantastic business. They were very wealthy people making ship's biscuits. Another resident is Thomas Widdowson. Sorry, not Thomas, George Widdowson, moving to the White House, downsizing effectively from Bell House, where he was living, when his wife died. And he was a silversmith. Here's his shop in the Strand, Widdowson and Veal. Here's some of the things he made. And here again is when he died in 1873. Here is a list of the things that were being sold. The interesting thing is, in the Victorian times, executors tended to sell everything. They obviously wanted the money. They didn't tend to keep it. So you've got here 1,100 ounces of plate, jewelry, Dresden and Sèvres china, 100 volumes of books, again, 40 dozen of choice wine. These are pretty abstemious. That's only 500 bottles, isn't it? The piano, everybody had a piano. Early elegant cabinets, the candelabra, the clocks, carriage and dog cart to drive around. And it was partly a farm, so you had plants, cows, stacks of hay. I'd love to know what outdoor effects are. Perhaps it's chairs and tables or something. But after him, it was Edward Beans of Havana, Cuba. Edward Beans was an engineer, and his interest was sugar refining. And as you can see here, here he is sitting here. Love the beards of the other chaps, but he was a more modern. That's the kind of beard I like, not this sort. But here's his specification for a patent in America. He lived on Dulwich Common before he moved to the White House. And it's fascinating when you read, these guys must have spent months, traveling to and from Cuba across the Atlantic in an old paddle steamer. And yet they seem to manage quite well. But he was another rich, wealthy engineer. And then we have, by the time the 1875 comes, the 1880s comes along, the White House is no longer much good as a house. It's too big, and it goes to schools. And there's 2 schools there. And this is the more interesting one, is the second one, because it's called St. Austins. And as many of you will know, P.G. Woodhouse, pupil at Dulwich College, calls his school Stories at St. Austins, and that's where he presumably got the name from. Herbert Baring Harrington was the owner, and he, as you can see here, it was a sort of crammer for Woolwich, Sandhurst, and the universities. So if the Dulwich College didn't do it, you sent your son here. So limited number of pupils, personal treatment, great individual attention, great house in 8 acres, all the sports. And here's his sort of, record: 4 passed into Sandhurst, 1 into Woolwich, and 3 for the army, and 1 for the professional, whatever that might be. But I think it's quite interesting that Woodhouse would have known it, because he was here around 1900, and he would have known the building and the name. But we've passed on and this is strictly not a lost house of Dulwich, but it's such a fascinating story. We must pause briefly on it. And this is St. Austins, the one you know today. If you go down Dulwich Village, this is what you'll see. Not the greenhouse, but that's the front elevation. It was built 1902. And this is the most interesting owner, William Cooper, who was really big in temporary structures, in producing greenhouses, sheds. And he was the one who was responsible for the Bath Works. And you'll know it from Herne Hill, the Bath trading estate at the back of Herne Hill with the railway line was owned by him originally. And he was actually making garden buildings there. But his real interest, there was, as they saying goes, there was far more to him that meets the eye. Although he called himself Cooper, that wasn't his name. He changed his name to Cooper when he bought the Cooper greenhouse business. But his actual main business was Turkish baths. And he was called William Busk, never changed his name, although his wife did afterwards. And he was London's largest interwar Turkish bath proprietor. And when you look at him, he's looked such a sort of ordinary looking bloke. Somehow you expect Turkish bath proprietors to be slightly exotic. But there was a lot of fuss. He had a huge business here. You know, here's his Westminster trying to close him down in Jermyn Street because of perhaps unsavory activities in the bath, but he got away with it. And here is the tea bath, and that's why it was called, his business was called Tea Bath. It was the Turkish Bath Company Limited. He owned the Savoy Turkish Baths, and this is where he lived. So just fascinating. There's a whole thing online about London Turkish baths, and he features quite strongly in it. But let's cross the road to the Hall. This is the house at the corner of East Dulwich Grove and Dulwich Village. There's a rather nice Art Deco house on the corner at the moment, number 1 Dulwich Village, and that's the site. Here are the people who lived there. And there was a house well before this chap was here. Here's a rear elevation. This is taken about 1920 when they were knocking down the rear garden for Gilks Crescent, just before the house itself was knocked down. Here's 2 lease plans showing the original. This was what it would have been in the 1850s. Here's the house, and here's somebody else's property. You can see how much land they had at the back. And this is it after the construction of East Dulwich Grove in the 1880s. So you've got the same house, but a lot less land. And here you have one of the early occupiers was John Courage, not the original John Courage who set up Courage Breweries, but his son, who actually made the business what it is, hardly today, but what it was at the time, because the first John Courage died relatively young. This is the second John Courage. And of course, this is the Courage Brewery up in town. And here he is, happy chappy. And here we have Tom Morris again. And this is the one about the Persian ambassador. Tom Morris says that the Persian ambassador lived at the house. And he's right about Persia. He's not right about the ambassador, although you could argue that it was an ambassador, but it was the British ambassador to Persia. And here we have Sir Ronald Ferguson Thompson, who spent his whole life in Tehran as an assistant to the Shah, the minister's plenipotentiary of Persia. And he retired. Nobody knows quite why he came to Dulwich, but he retired to Dulwich and took over the Hall. And one of his early letters to the Dulwich estate was, "I'm not sure how long I'm going to be here. I really can't stand the weather," after living in Tehran. And he lasted about 6 months. So he started work on the house and then died. And here's his grave in Beckenham Cemetery. And then, so the house by this time was run down, and the estate really thought they were going to have to knock it down. So they started hunting around for builders until they had an unsolicited approach from a chap called David Cripps Preston, who was actually better known locally as a monumental mason. He had a works near one of the cemeteries, and his business was carving gravestones. But as you will see, he also had many other businesses. He developed in Bedford, built towns. Holland-on-Sea is one of his, and it's all here. He owned the South London Mail at one time. He was, a major player in the Camberwell Vestry. Don't think he was mayor, but he did a lot of things. Anyway, he took over and kept the house going, really, until the 1920s. And then when he'd gone, the house really had it, and the executors paid up their dilapidations and gave it back to the estate, who knocked it down. Now, this is Menival. Well, known in later life as Fairfield. There is a house there now, number 9 Dulwich Village, called Fairfield, roughly on the site, but nothing quite of the size. And this is the view you would have had of the house as you were walking along Dulwich Village. It's pretty grand, pretty grand. This is 1900. And here again, there it is. Here you are walking along Dulwich Village. There's the hall. There's East Dulwich Grove. But now we've got Elms Crescent or Gilks Crescent, and Gilks would have been built later through here. But yeah, quite a lot of land. And here's Lake Cottage. And here are some of the tenants, occupiers. One of the occupiers was a chap called Clarkson Palmer. And his grave is here in the Dulwich burial ground, along with his mother-in-law, his wife, and various others. And there's a famous painting, which if you go into the Dulwich Society's burial ground article, it's all there about Kitty Palmer. Who was she and what did she do? You've got Sir Robert Graham, the baronet, who lived there for a while, and this is his Northumberland family home. And then you had a stockbroker, Giles Telford. We know, because we slightly know who they are because of these newspaper articles, but also a lot of their occasional sons and daughters were christened at Christ Chapel. This is what the house looked like in the 1840s. We think Francis Freeling Tuke, who was a wealthy city wine merchant, took it over in 1827. And one of the things he had to do was to rebuild it. So we think this is what he rebuilt it. This is an original painting, about 1840. And he was the illegitimate son of George Bridges MP, Lord Mayor of London. But again, he was pretty well off, a wine and brandy merchant at 25 Crutched Friars. And this is what the house looked like when he was there. But when he died quite suddenly in 1847, the house was taken over by a builder, quite a large London builder called John Wilson, with 2 L's. And he clearly rebuilt it and into this rather grand shot you see here. So this is a garden elevation after 1850. You can see from the census how his business, he starts with 89 men and 6 boys, and by 1861 he's got 270 odd. He's a successful builder, and this is he tries to, but he's obviously a trade. I mean, the estate think he's a bit of a tradesman, so when he tries to suggest to the Dulwich estate that he could help them develop some of the undeveloped parts of the estate, they were a bit sniffy, and he was rebuffed. But the other interesting thing about him is one often thinks today how builders operate today and how much of the work is subcontracted out. You get a builder in and he subcontracts work out. And even here in 1853, they were subcontracting. He was working at the cattle market at Copenhagen Fields, and he wanted the stuff taken away, the debris, the rubbish and the excavations taken away. So he wanted 200 one-horse carts and drivers for day work. So even then he was subbing it out. That's a fair number of carts. But here was some of his work. This is the cattle market, Metropolitan Cattle Market at Copenhagen Fields. John Wilson of Southwark and the contractors. And here he is at the Adelphi Theatre in 1858. And he was, his claim to fame, if you like, was he used a wrought iron roof structure. Independently, the brick walls, radical stuff at the time, and lots of cantilevers and things. I mean, this is the second version of the Adelphi Theatre. I think we're now on the 4th or 5th. But in those days, while the engineers were involved, it was generally the contractor who did this kind of work, but he was pretty successful. And here we have the shot, again, taken in 1920 when they're constructing Gilks Crescent. Here's the hall, and here is Menival. And here's another resident. This is Henry Barrett. of Barrett's Stout. Here's Barrett's Brewery in the Wandsworth Road. And here's Barrett's Stout, which is obviously good for invalids. As you can see, I don't think you could sell it like that now. Yeah, there's the poor lady in bed. And the doctor comes along and says, drink a bit of that. And there she is. She's up and at it. But his claim to fame was to have invented the screw top bottle. Not a cork, was sort of cork. Before that, bottles were beer were corked. And cork on a bottle of beer is not that great an idea. You need to hold it in. And he invented a stopper, a screw stopper. So you had a screw thread in the bottle and a screw stopper. And this was his patent from 1880. And it was in use till the 1970s. This is, in terms of beer brewing, if you like, a radical step forward. But let's move, and here we are later. There's a different lease. You can see the orchard. There's Lake House, the orchard. That's where the village hall is now. Shops are here. Bryson was just one of the other ones, other tenants. He was only there for a short time. But you can see here that the houses are proving difficult to let because Boroughs Welcome come along and suggest that they might like to use the house as laboratories and stables, which would mean a lot of horses being kept and other animals. The answer was no. And of course, they went off to Brockwell Park. And then we got coming on to Walter Harvey here. You'll all know H&T Pawnbrokers. That was Walter Harvey's business. Here we go, Harvey and Thompson. I can't find his shops, but these are 1960s when it was still called Harvey and Thompson. But it's now H&T, and I think it is the biggest pawnbroker in the country. But he changed the name to Fairfield. And again, here is the house struggling. When he dies, to get rid of it. Somebody wants her on to use as a convalescent home for children. The estate don't say no to start with, but once they realised what was going on, treatment by massage and electricity, orthopedic, but not tubercular, because tubercular would be perhaps a too far tubercular thing. And here, medical strict supervision, but the answer was no, and they pulled it down. So here we have, towards the end of its life, Menival. A fine house. It was a fine property. And there was the garden. Fantastic. But let's look at Lake Cottage, Lake House. Here we go. Menival is over here. Lake House here, named Lake because originally the long pond was here. And it was originally called Chinese Cottage because it was built in the Chinese style. And here is a few of those. Sir Robert Graham is appearing again. Dubrow was leasing it from Crozier, and there was a case where he was robbed and his manservant was shot at. And then we got Raincock. We go to Raincock. No, we don't. We go to Frederick Cleaver, who was in soaps. He was a perfumer and his toothpaste. Frederick Cleaver, son of William Cleaver. But the interesting thing was his connection with the Yardley family, because the Cleavers were originally quite a large soap business and they borrowed money off the Yardleys and couldn't pay it back. So the Yardleys took over their business. And Frederick Cleaver was employed by the Yardleys to manage the Yardley business until he decided to go into business on his own in the 1840s. And this is the kind of thing he would produce. I think they're rather fine things. But yes, soaps, toilet waters, toiletries, face powders, and pomades. He was followed by Frederick Beasley, who was basically sewers and water engineer, quite well known at the time. He was originally studied architecture and actually built some schools in Hornchurch with the prize. But he went into partnership with Edward Gotto, who was already a successful engineer, and they carried out huge numbers of drainage and water supply works Here we are in Rio de Janeiro. Looks like that today, but it looked like that then. And I love this thing, how they invent the drainage network, because the original system consisted of slaves carrying waste from the homes to dump it directly into surrounding waters at night, presumably in carts. A bit like the night soil man we used to have in the City of London. Not very PC. And then it was the Reverend Howard Nixon who took over. Now, Reverend Howard Nixon was the vicar of St. Barnabas, and he was brought to Dulwich as the first vicar to get St. Barnabas built. And he lived in Lake House for quite some time until the vicarage in Carlton Avenue was built. Here's Booth's survey in 1900, which interviews Nixon and describes him. I mean, we've luckily got a picture here. Pleasant expression, a pleasant manner, his slightly upturned nose with his humorous look. And it says here, he's free from all vulgarity and cant, essential features, I think, in a minister. But he used to hold, in Lake House, he used to hold garden parties to raise money for the church, for the construction of the church. And it's interesting that the MPs knew they had to be there. So here you have Rutherford Harris, who's MP in the late 1890s, early 1900s, rather fine moustache, and Bonar Law, whose plaque you all know is on the village hall, because he laid the foundation stone. So everybody did that. And here's the church, the Iron Church in Woodward Road, St. Barnabas itself. And this is something, he was pretty active, very active in getting the church constructed. And this was his, if you like, he was Queen's College, Oxford. He was originally curate of Kingston, then St. Barnabas of Dulwich, and here's his address, Lake House. And you'll spot, of course, there's no tower because this was taken before the tower was built. And then we have Henry Newton Knights MP, who was an interesting character. He was in business of making Stokes bombs for the British Army in World War I. And he became an MP. He was quite an active member of the Camberwell Borough Council, and he became an MP. But it obviously got on top of him, whether it's his business or being an MP. And he had a mental breakdown, and he disappeared, and his family tried to find him, but couldn't. And he turned up later, not remembering what had happened, what he'd done. But anyway, he went bankrupt. And of course, as all of you will know, you can't be a bankrupt and be an MP. So he had to resign. And the last really tenant was Mrs. Lydia Moore. Now, I show a picture here of Queen Victoria because I don't have a picture of Mrs. Lydia Moore. But in an article by Brian Green in our journal, it said that Mrs. Lydia Moore was the splitting image of Queen Victoria. So here she is, Queen Victoria. She lived previously at Lindenhurst with her. When her husband died in 1920, she moved over to Lake House after Newton Knights. And he was director of a shipping line. So these were not poor people, wealthy people. Anyway, Mrs. Lydia Moore. Love to have a picture of her, but that's... And there, of course, is the school where Lake House used to be. And our final house is Beech House, often known as Warigul, but for most of its life, Beech House. This is a shot taken 1900 from High Street, Dulwich, looking over the wall. Here's the lease plan. This is the school would be here. Here's some of the tenants, and you can see the size of the property. Sorry, we've got Mr. Raincock here, the East India House. Raincock was the freight accountant and clerk to the Committee of Private Trade in the East India Company. Basically, he controlled what private, or shall we say business on the side, the East India ship captains could do, because they were allowed to do their own business on the side as long as they brought back what they were supposed to bring back for the company. That's the East India Company's plaque. And here's the sale, being sold, the quantity of the house being sold, as you can see. It's also a farm. You've got the cows, the Hoffer, the greenhouse plants. So this is William Hill. And you've got this, when you look at, they're always the same, all these mahogany wardrobes, dressing stands, rosewood sofa tables, but it's in Indian bamboo chairs. Fantastic stuff. And the dung carts, and not to forget his old port and Madeira, etc. The next occupier was Samuel Jones. Now, Samuel Jones is not as famous as perhaps he should be, because he invented the safety match, or not quite the safety match, or it was originally invented by this chap here, James Walker, a chemist, how to work a safety match, but he didn't patent his invention, and it was effectively, says here, copied. Stolen is probably a better word, by Jones, who really, they're not quite what we would know as a safety match. They had a small glass bulb containing of sulfuric acid. Not very health and safety, but interestingly, they had great reviews at the time, because it was fascinating to think you could actually, strike a match anywhere. It's like you see cowboys, isn't it? They were, you'd see Westerns when they're always striking matches against their boot. Anyway, he didn't last long in Dulwich, but he made a lot of money, and Tom Morris even suggested he manufactured the matches on site at Beech House, but I don't think so. But here is Beech House, and here is Thomas Ingleby Miller, solicitor, wealthy solicitor, the next occupier, and he was there for 44 years. What's nice, we have great pictures of the house, because we were contacted about 12 months ago by one of his descendants, and they sent us these picture of him and his pictures. He was very wealthy. He was involved in railway companies in the 1840s and 50s, funding those. And he had an office in the city, but he wasn't particularly famous for anything. Here's another shot of the house. These are really good shots. And here is the farm. Here's the house, and there's the sort of farm. And you realize this was almost in Dulwich Village, just around the back of the school. So where Tony Road is today. He was followed by William Silver Ford, who was a partner in the firm of Dryden Ford in Southwark, who made printing machines. And their particular knack was making a perfecting machine, in this case a two-cylinder perfecting machine, which enabled you to print on both sides. This was a really radical advance in printing, because prior to that, you could only print on one side, and then you'd have to put the paper back again, a bit like you do on a copier when it doesn't print double-sided. So this is, if you like, the Victorian version of our double-sided copier, the perfecting machine. And then we come to the final occupier of the house, is Henry Francis Eaton, who came from Australia, who retired to Dulwich from Australia. He had no connection with Dulwich at all, as far as we can work out. He was born in Nottinghamshire, been out to Victoria, to Melbourne, and become a very successful civil servant. He was head of the Treasury in Victoria, and he retired. We suspect he probably came back because his daughter was a doctor in London. He probably came back, and they lived here in the house. He died about 1912, and she was one of the very early women doctors in this country, and one of the first medical officers in the newly formed Department of Health in 1919. Unfortunately, she lasted just over a year before dying from cardiac failure. And the house was sold. She died. The state took the estate back. The house was sold, and that's where it would have been today. Here's the bench put in there by one of our former chairmen, with a little plaque there. And in fact, the house, number 18, was called Warigul. The Australian chap renamed it Warigul. It'd been Beech House until he arrived, and then he named it Warigul, which is a town in Victoria. But there you go. There's the story of Dulwich Village's lost mansions.